At the turn of the 20th century, a man named Ota Benga was displayed at the Bronx Zoo with monkeys and chimpanzees. He was an African housed at the zoo as living proof of an inferior race. 100 years after this bizarre event, we can look back now and ponder how it came to be that, in the United States, a human being was actually housed with primates. Several argued then, as some would today, that such an action has nothing to do with race. You be the judge.
The message my grandfather had given me about how we don't get to choose our parents because he felt he had done possibly something very wrong was maybe a pretty important message. I guess it's fair to say that I'm conflicted on this, you know? Well, the conflicts of whether I should be proud of an ancestor or embarrassed by him.
New York Times headline, September 9th, 1906. Bushman shares a cage with Bronx Zoo apes.
The pygmy was not much taller than the orangutan, and one had a good opportunity to study their points of resemblance. Their heads are much alike, and both grin in the same way when pleased. New York Times, September 10th, 1906.
In that sort of period, at the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that idea that there were missing links, there were halfway houses, as it were, between the two, was quite a well-established idea, even in biology.
The idea was that you could look at Africans as a different stage in the human evolution, but really they were so far apart, so far away, that you can do very much about them.
Ota Benga est une victime du darwinisme sommaire.
Ota Benga is a victim of an interpretation of Darwinism. This interpretation is actually very far from Charles Darwin's actual thoughts that we can find in the media which criticized him. In particular, in the media influenced by religion, specifically in England and the United States. It says that Darwin argued that men came from monkeys, something that Darwin actually never said. Then, in this hypothesis that man came from monkeys, which were descended from chimpanzees, the closest animal relative to man, it was necessary in simple minds who believed in evolution to find the intermediaries between men and chimpanzees.
If Darwin had never existed, Ota Benga would have been exposed, put there all the same, in the name of other things, in the name of Norton or Mott or Virey or Bory, I don't want to drop names, of a variety of other people who said the same things. So there was no lack of racial theories around.
The reality is, of course, sort of if you're putting somebody in a cage like that, you automatically kind of demean them in some way, don't you? So,
well, I've known the story since I was a child. My grandmother used to tell me the stories of the enchanted hippopotamus and the wars between the ants and all the different things that go on in the life of a pygmy household in Africa. And as I grew older and older, I realized that the message my grandfather had given me about how we don't get to choose our parents because he felt he had done possibly something very wrong was maybe a pretty important message. He was the valedictorian of his college class at Columbia. He was considered very brilliant, but he grew up in a family where his father was very racist and really didn't think black people would ever amount to anything. And as compared to his mother, who was the daughter of a university president in North Carolina, who believed that education made all the difference in the world and that anybody capable of being educated was just as good as anybody else, and that the brain of a black man is the same color as the brain of a white man. So she felt very, very generously toward helping the black people improve so that they could build a new South after the Civil War together, with the idea that the hard work of the black man would finally be rewarded and they would work even harder yet. And if they're recognized as at an equal level with white folks, they would have a terrific economic recovery in the South, whereas my great-grandfather Werner's father believed that it was a waste of time to work with black people, just to let them go away, you know.
Meeting at the Berlin residence the German Imperial Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884, the foreign ministers of 14 European powers and the United States established ground rules for the future exploitation of Africa. Africans were not invited or made privy to their decisions. In that partition, Leopold was appointed referee and umpire. He would also receive land in Africa. The Congo was bestowed on him as a personal gift and possession. Missouri poet and writer Mark Twain is disgusted with Leopold's savagery in the Congo. Leopold decreed the burning of homes, chopping off of limbs, and torture as punishment if and where production quotas for rubber and materials failed to meet his benchmark. In 1905, Mark Twain's monologue, King Leopold's Soliloquy, is published. It's a work of political satire, harshly condemning Leopold's actions. In it, Leopold speaks in his own defense.
If I had them by the throat, in these 20 years I have spent millions to keep the press of the two hemispheres quiet, and still these leaks keep on occurring. In print I get nothing but slanders, and slanders again, and still slanders, and slanders on top of slanders. Grant them true, what of it? They are slanders all the same when uttered against a king. They have told how for 20 years I have ruled the Congo state not as a trustee of the powers, an agent, a subordinate, a foreman, but as a sovereign over a fruitful empire 4 times as large as the German Empire, seizing and holding the state as my personal property, the whole of its vast revenues as my private swag, mine, solely mine, claiming and holding its millions of people as my private property, my serfs, my slaves, their labor mine, with or without wage. The food they raise not their property but mine. The rubber, the ivory, and all the other riches of the land mine. Mine solely, and gathered from me by the men, the women, and the little children under compulsion of lash and bullet, fire, starvation, mutilation, and the halter. They have revealed these and yet other details which shame should have kept them silent about, since they were exposures of a king, a sacred personage and immune from reproach, by right of his selection and appointment to his great office by God himself, a king whose acts cannot be criticized.
Otabenga became a casualty of this atrocity. When one day he returned home from a hunting expedition with kinsmen, only to find the village empty. Women and children all gone. They would embark on days of a futile search for their families and eventually return to find the village completely razed and torched. Within weeks, Otabenga would learn that his wife and 2 children had been brutally murdered. This was the handiwork of the Belgian Force Publique. Benga immediately sought out and attacked the captain of the Force Publique. He did not succeed. He was arrested, tortured, and delivered for sale at a slave market. About the same time in 1902, another continent away in St. Louis, Missouri, W.J. McGee was organizing what was referred to as the World Anthropological Games as part of the St. Louis World's Fair.
He was one of the people who commissioned Werner to go to the Congo to bring back what was supposedly would represent this scientific sense that there was a unilineal evolution of humankind. Whites were at the top, blacks were at the bottom. And so the displays of humankind was going to be like the representation. It was the physical evidence. It was the ultimate in reality TV, if you like. Here they are, and this represents what we're trying to say.
The major aim of the anthropological fair was essentially to display the superiority of the Caucasian race above all non-Western races of humanity. Other people to be exhibited at the fair included the Igorots from the Philippines and the Apache leader, Geronimo. McGee desperately wanted Africans to complete and authenticate his display. So in 1904, he contracted an American missionary, Samuel Phillips Werner, to bring pygmies back from Africa.
October 21st, 1902, St. Louis, Missouri. Sir, by authority of the Louisiana Purchase Expedition Company, you are hereby commissioned as a special agent of this department and authorized to organize and conduct an expedition into the interior of Africa for the purpose of obtaining anthropological material and offering certain natives the opportunity of attending the exposition in person. I have the honor to be yours with respect, W.J. McGee, Chief.
Now, the fact that it was illegal in those days is a moot point. You know, he was sent on a mission to collect 18 Africans from the Congo. He came back with 4.
And so Werner decided he'd make up his mind for himself and decide that he'd go to Africa. And the way to do that was to join the Presbyterian missions because that would pay all the bills. And so he prevailed upon an uncle who was able to get him through a seminary in 3 days to get ordained. Now, you know, what am I to think of that when his best friend there and the person who went with him his first African trip took 3 years to get ordained, Reverend Joseph Phipps. So it's a bit of a sham. And but anyway, he went there under the pretense of being a Presbyterian missionary. I say pretense. He was actually ordained, but it was a pretense.
October 22nd, 1903. My dear Dr. McGee, the first pygmy has been secured. He was obtained from a village in which he was held captive, having been taken prisoner at a remote point in the great Kansia forest, 12 days' march from any white settlement. Although still 200 miles from our final destination, I thought it well to secure him. This pygmy belongs to the same ethnic group as the Batwa. As I wish to have him ready for the steamer, I cannot enlarge upon the characteristics now, but will add to this if I have time. But he is one of them beyond any peradventure. Thanking you for your encouraging letter, I am, my dear doctor, with the warmest regards, truly yours, S.P. Werner.
An outbreak of panic ensued when the headlines of the St. Louis newspapers started reporting Werner as missing in Africa, dead, or even possibly eaten up by African cannibals. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch of Monday, April 18, 1904, queried, "Exposition envoy Pygmy's victim?" and then reported that fair officials have not heard for 2 months from explorers sent to Africa wilds. A month later, the St. Louis Republic of May 5, 1904, followed suit. Werner escapes being eaten by cannibals, the paper reported. These rumored reports, along with the protests by African missionaries about the mistreatment of Africans in the Congo, bothered McGee as a possible deterrent to the arrival of pygmies in St. Louis.
April 1st, 1904. My dear Mr. Werner, it is a pleasure to acknowledge receipt of your letter of February 18, which came this morning, and to congratulate you on the eminent success of your expedition up to the date of your writing. The small formalities attending to the payment in accordance with local banking customs had attention yesterday. I can only say that while it would be desirable to have the pygmies here on the first day of May, it would be incomparably better to have them later than not at all. Noting the obstacles on the part of African missionaries who have appealed to President Roosevelt regarding alleged cruelties by Belgian officials, Washington has met the allegations by statements that, to say the least, reflect no credits on the complaints. I make but a simple plea. Get the pygmies. Believe me to remain most cordially yours, signed W.J. McGee.
I think in 1903, Reverend Samuel Philip Werner, a missionary of the Presbyterian Church, came to the Congo. He was recruited by Dr. Shepherd. And when he came to the Congo, he was interested in some young people who would help him with his traveling and collection of art, artifacts, and so forth. And then he got about 3 young men to help him to do the cooking and so forth. And those 3 young men came from the eastern part of the Congo, from my own village. And then my father also was a young person in the area, already in the area of Luebo, so they were together. And Otabenga also, when he was purchased by Reverend Werner, came to Luebo, and so he was there with my father and so forth. I knew nothing about Otabenga until when I came to the United States. My wife told me I was a student, maybe my first year at graduate study at Harvard. And my wife told me, she said that she read in the newspapers a story about a pygmy who was brought to this country and was exposed to who was exhibit and then dropped in the zoo and all this kind of thing. And that was, tuning in my mind all these years and so forth.
So Otabenga gets here, and it goes through a humiliating process. Most of the people, I'm not saying all, who appear on the surface to be truly interested in the cultural betterment of a group of people would not march them around to exploit them and would not have as the main objectives a bottom line figure.
Werner had a contract with the St. Louis Exposition to travel to Africa, which would pay his fare and provide all the money for the goods and stuff that he needed, and for the gifts for the tribal chiefs if he needed to give them gifts, and for other sundry things, everything from stamps to... It was spelled out in every detail. I have a copy of that contract if you'd like to see it. But it didn't say anything like capture them in the woods or, it was supposed to be a voluntary proposition. At least the contract said so. He had 50 trunks of stuff that he took over and 50 trunks of stuff that he brought back when he traveled. He traveled by steamer. And he would go to London first, get some medical advice from Dr. Manson. Then he would go to Antwerp and get permission from King Leopold II, who ostensibly owned the entire Congo. It's called the Congo Free State, so everybody had to get permission from him. By the way, Leopold, who supposedly owned the Congo Free State, had never set foot in Africa at all his entire life. It was a bizarre kind of arrangement, if you can use that word. But anyway, Werner would get permission from Leopold, and then he would go down to stop at the Canary Islands at Tenerife, and then from there to Matadi, which is on the coast of the Belgian Congo. Belgian Congo does not have a long coast. It's just a narrow coast on either side of the Congo River. And it's a narrow neck that goes way 400 miles inland. You arrive at what is now Kinshasa. It used to be called Leopoldville, which is the capital. And then he would go from there 3 weeks by foot to Ndambi's village. So it was an arduous trip in those days. It was not easy to do.
The storms gathering above Otabenga's life were, to say the least, ominous. His homeland was under the control of Leopold's Force Publique. His family had been wiped out. He was en route to the USA to be put on display at the St. Louis World's Fair, in a country barely 40 years removed from enslavement and civil war. A country still grappling with the notion of racial equality or inequality, depending on whether you were Union or Confederate. Darwin's The Origin of the Species, first published in 1859, had gained momentum in the USA among evolutionists and adherents of the natural selection theory. McGee, chief of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, was also the first president of the American Anthropology Association. Thus, his ambitions for the exhibit were to be exhaustively scientific in his demonstration of the stages of human evolution. Thus, he required darkest blacks to be set off against dominant whites. He wanted members of the lowest known culture to contrast with its highest culmination. He needed to prove for anthropology the superiority of Caucasians over every other race.
Darwin has never been a theoretician of race. In fact, all his life he fought to say that the differences between the human groups do not exist. He believed that you shade. He didn't believe there are races. That's the point. Darwin did not believe there are races. He believed there are populations. And populations can change over time. And he said very clearly that if you put all the human groups together, they fade the one into the other imperceptibly. So clearly, if you take a pygmy and a Swede, they are very different. But to say that there are two completely different races since the beginning is to miss the point that if you put, I'm saying the Swede and the pygmy simply because I am mocking the language of the time, not because I believe the Swede is just to take two extremes, because physically they are different. Darwin would say, well, but if you look at all the gradations, they fade, one group fades into the other. So Darwin was not only, from the scientific point of view, he did not believe that races exist. Only populations exist. And populations are groups of individuals, of humans, of animals, of plants, who live in a territory, who are subjected to constant change, that can change again. Darwin's theories were used by almost everybody. In the political realm, you had socialists using Darwin, extreme right-wing using Darwin, anarchists using Darwin, pacifists using Darwin, even Lenin and the theory of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union using Darwinian arguments. So it became a kind of, as Kant will say, a kind of night where all cows are black. That is, it's very difficult to install a one-to-one relationship. And in the United States itself, the majority of the public opinion was not Darwinian. It was naturalists who tried to impose or tried to argue for an evolutionary view of nature. And some Darwinists were also racialists, but equally, numbers of pious, devout Christians were racialists and anti-Darwinians.
In that sort of period, at the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that idea that there were missing links, there were halfway houses, as it were, between the two, was quite a well-established idea, even in biology. Actually, biologically, it's nonsense. You can't have a missing link because the chimpanzees and we have evolved equally away from our common ancestor. So the common ancestor between ourselves and the chimpanzees as our nearest biological relatives, our sister species, as it were, is not a chimpanzee. It's something else that, may well share some traits with both of us, but certainly isn't a chimpanzee, because the chimpanzees themselves have had, whatever it is, 6 million years of evolution from that common ancestor, exactly the same as we have. So you can understand that if you really look at it from a Darwinian point of view, the whole idea of a missing link is completely misconceived. It just can't be.
Alors, c'est l'anthropologie coloniale qui a poussé à la classification.
It was the colonial anthropology that pushed the classification of men in detail. A lot of the material was written by anthropologists who were biologists, and others show the evolution tree in which you will see sponges and worms.
Montre, par exemple, des arbres de l'évolution.
And above them, you will find insects, and above them, mammals, and at the top, you find monkeys, primates, and man is situated at the top.
Les vertébrés, les mammifères. Tout en haut, on a les singes, les primates, et dans un arbre de Haeckel, par exemple, c'est l'homme.
Men are separated amongst the branches, and among the branches, some are higher than others, particularly Germanic and Anglo-Saxons.
population germanique et anglo-saxonne.
Then it was a question of explaining the superiority of the civilization that would steer humanity, who considers that with its culture and origins, that they had a right to rule the world, especially the economic right to go to other territory that did not belong to them. To justify their authority, they proclaimed superiority, and this superiority gave them a historical dimension in placing others on the ladder of evolution.
Before Benga's June 1904 arrival in the USA, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had released an illustrated full-page article titled African Pygmies for the World's Fair, under the subtitle, Here are some queer facts about African pygmies. It goes on to list over 100 items, some of which are:
they have exaggerated development of the abdomen. Their normally large heads are mounted on weak and thin necks. They are extremely cunning and dexterous.
Public records at the Missouri History Museum indicate that close to 20 million visitors attended the fair. The Congolese presence at the fair was primarily staged to present Africans as being at the earliest stage of human evolution and therefore savages.
First cabinets of curiosities and then museums showing objects from around the world. Exhibiting people was very much a part of the same project. It was the natural extension of pre-colonial and colonial museums. So the idea was that once you had already become accustomed to exhibiting objects and drawing people to museums, the next exciting things that you could do was to exhibit people. And I think that gives the measure of how dehumanizing this was.
At the conclusion of the World's Fair in St. Louis, from all accounts, Oda Benga and Werner journeyed to the Congo together, and then both returned to the USA. It was at this time that Werner dropped Oda Benga off at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City with its director, Herman C. Bumpus. At the Museum of Natural History, Oda Benga roamed the floors of the museums and was locked in at night with dinosaur skeletons and meteorite rocks. He spent many nights alone just gazing at the stars. At one point, he attempted to escape the confines of the museum by trying to exit the gate amidst visiting crowds and was stopped by security. He was reported to Bumpus, who warned him, using sign language, never try escaping the museum grounds. Bumpus decided to conduct a fundraiser with all the elite socialites and millionaires in New York City, including Miss Florence Guggenheim. Oda Benga was to be the main attraction. Bumpus introduced Oda Benga to Guggenheim, saying,
Here is a pygmy whose people have not progressed even to the need for stone.
To which Guggenheim responds,
Poor thing, so I can't interest you in shares of gold or aluminum, can I?
To which there is general laughter in the room at Oda Benga's expense. Bumpus then tells Benga to go fetch a chair for Mrs. Guggenheim so she can sit. Benga walks across the room, picks up a chair, and hurls it at Mrs. Guggenheim's head, barely missing it. There is shock in the room, and Oda Benga walks away, leaving Bumpus humiliated. The very next day, Bumpus sends a cable to Werner.
Come and pick up the pygmy. He has become unmanageable. Come now.
Bumpus suggests that Werner contact William Hornaday, the director of the Bronx Zoological Gardens, who had shown interest in Oda Benga at the museum.
I have arranged to place the African in satisfactory hands and hope to get him away today.
He was referring to William Hornaday, the director of the Bronx Zoo. In a memo dated September 19, 1906, to Charles Barney, the chairman of the New York Zoological Society, William Hornaday declares the economic success of Ota Benga at the zoo.
The crowd last Sunday, September 16th, numbered nearly 40,000, and on Monday morning, the park was a sight. The attendance is nearly 100,000 ahead of his date last year.
Ota Benga ends up at the Bronx Zoo, where William T. Hornaday, a wildlife advocate, believed Africans belonged with wildlife. Madison Grant, the secretary of the Wildlife Conservation Society, is a eugenist and renowned architect of racial hygiene and scientific racism. He assisted in the passing and prosecution of several anti-miscegenation laws, notably the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 in the state of Virginia, where he sought to codify his particular version of the one-drop rule into law. Grant is famous for his 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race.
A rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would solve the whole question in 100 years, as well as enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. And perhaps ultimately to worthless race types.
Passing of the Great Race received acclaim from Adolf Hitler, who wrote Letter of Praises to Grant. He called the book his Bible. These were the men and forces that would determine Ota Benga's life and destiny. As to be expected, the sight of Ota Benga in the zoo raised fury and concerns from some members of the New York public. The New York Times was less than charitable on the affair.
Ota Benga is a normal specimen of his race or tribe, with a brain as much developed as are those of its other members, whether they are held to be illustrations of arrested development and really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes. They are of equal interest to the student of ethnology and can be studied with profit. September 11th, 1906, New York Times.
That whole period in the 19th century was it was the end of the period of discovery. It was the period when we set up museums. These were meant to kind of display these peoples, as it were, in their natural environment. And I think it kind of built on that kind of curiosity, voyeurish view that I guess we all kind of have about strange things we've never seen before. So you see it in the kind of the Bill Cody Wild West show. You would have Indians there as sort of living in their teepees and what have you, trying to give a sense of what life was like.
It's also quite telling that in the texts that were written at the time, no one ever mentions the perspective of the human beings who were being exhibited. Whether it's Sarah, Bartman, Ota Benga, others, we know very little about what they thought about being exhibited. It's always the gaze of others, and it's always assumed that they must be happy because they had a different kind of consciousness. Of course, objects do not have consciousness. And I think the timing of the rise of museums and the rise of exhibitions of human beings is no coincidence. It is really very much a project of turning human beings into objects.
Oui, c'est une attraction énorme.
It was an enormous attraction.
Dès que les eaux humaines
There were a lot of visitors.
tu vois que
As soon as the human zoo was tied to the exposition, you saw that the number of visitors increased.
l'opportunité de
And it was also an opportunity to show racial variety amongst Africans that were here.
et notamment
And notably, the pygmy was sought by Belgians to show this racial diversity.
la diversité raciale.
At the end of the 19th century, the Casino de Paris and other theaters in Paris started exhibiting what they called Zulu dancers at the time, who were half naked. And they probably were not Zulu, but they were presented as Zulu dancers. And in order to make the exhibition the performance even more attractive, they also brought in black boxers from America. So there was an idea of performance and boxing being very similar, something that black bodies do very naturally, and which it's very natural to pay to come and watch.
Because, for instance, in France, they did the same during the Universal Exposition Universelle of the early 19th century. They recreated African villages, and they brought people from these villages. Otabenga was alone. In France, they brought entire villages. And of course, Parisians were walking on the other side of the fence, and these poor people were there to be shown, and the French were not Darwinian, were Lamarckians. So you see, they did the same on a completely different intellectual framework.
Where's the pygmy? At the monkey house.
Where is the pygmy? At the monkey house? Where is the pygmy? At the monkey house!
There were 40,000 visitors to the park on Sunday. Nearly every man, woman, and child of this crowd made for the monkey house to see the star attraction in the park, the wild man from Africa. They chased him about the grounds at day, howling, jeering, and yelling. Some of them poked him in the ribs. Others tripped him up. All laughed at him.
This believer in the Darwinian theory also concluded that there exists a close analogy of the African savage to the apes. New York Times, September 11th, 1906.
A group of black ministers in New York, led by Reverend James H. Gordon, evolved into a protest and demanded that Mayor McClellan stop the exhibition and order the release of Otabenga from the zoo.
The person responsible for this exhibition degrades himself as much as he does the African. Our Christian missionary societies must take this matter up at once. I shall communicate with Dr. Gilbert of Mount Olivet Baptist Church and pastors of colored congregations that we may work together in this matter. They will have my active assistance. The Reverend Dr. R.S. MacArthur, Calvary Baptist Church. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. The Darwinian theory is absolutely opposed to Christianity, and a public demonstration in its favor should not be permitted. Reverend James Gordon.
We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter. It is absurd to make moan over the imagined humiliation and degradation Benga is suffering. The pygmies are very low in the human scale, and the suggestion that Benga should be in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place from which he could draw no advantage whatsoever. The idea that men are all much alike except as they have lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books is now far out of date. New York Times.
Mayor McClellan ignores the ministers and representatives of the African American community by refusing to meet with them. He orders his aides to refer them back to the New York Zoological Society. This saga drew mixed reactions from New Yorkers, which can be adduced from several letters to the editors of the dailies.
The Caged Pygmy. To the editor of the Globe, Sir, I have lived in the South several years, and consequently am not over fond of the Negro, but believe him human. I think it's a shame that the authorities of this great city should allow such a sight as that witnessed at the Bronx Park. A Negro boy on exhibition in a monkey cage. If the park is so barren of interest as to necessitate such a degrading spectacle to attract the people, I think the best thing to do would be to close the gates. AER, New York, Wednesday, September 12th.
With pressure from the African American ministers and public opinion and sentiment in the newspapers going against the evolution experiment, and under threat of legal action, Hornaday became a director under siege. and battled on several fronts. First, he thanked Mayor McClellan for ignoring the ministers in a letter dated September 12, 1906.
We are glad to learn that you declined to seriously consider the absurd matter relating to Dr. Werner's African pygmy. The whole episode is a comic opera material and nothing more. When the history of the zoological park is written, this incident will form its most amusing passage. Signed, William Hornaday.
Hornaday then had Otabenga leave his cage daily and circulate around the zoo in a white suit. But he returned to the monkey house to sleep, which was still unpleasing to the black ministers.
We send our missionaries to Africa to Christianize the people, and we bring a native here to brutalize him.
This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard of. If the Reverend MacArthur or any other clergyman should get up any movement against this boy, he will make his race look ridiculous. As for the boy being exhibited in a cage, it was done simply for the convenience of the thousands of people who wanted to see him. We have no platform that we could place him on, and this big open-air cage was the best place we could find to put him where everybody could see him. Why, we are taking excellent care of this little fellow, and he is a great favorite with everybody connected with the zoo. He has one of the best rooms in the primate house.
It was not long before Otabenga's patience began to exhaust. In time, he began to detest being the object of curiosity. One afternoon, Otabenga got a hold of a knife, with which he tried to slash a zoo attendant.
Otabenga, the pygmy at the New York Zoological Gardens, the Bronx, made a desperate attempt to kill one of the keepers yesterday afternoon with a knife and had to be overpowered before he was driven into his cage. Benga was in good spirits yesterday and allowed the children and other visitors to tease him as much as they pleased. The New York Daily Tribune, Wednesday, September 26, 1906.
And this was not the last incident. There would be several more, as Otabenga took to fabricating a small bow and arrows and shooting at obnoxious park visitors in self-defense. Now he had to leave the park for good. Hornaday would not release him to the black ministers. He insisted on releasing him directly to Werner, as he writes in a memo to Charles Barney, the New York Zoological Society Executive Committee Chair.
We expect to get rid of the pygmy within the next 2 days or 3. But for the fact that Dr. Werner left for his home in North Carolina without my knowledge, the boy would have gone with him. I am so sorry that the Times has so wearied the public with this matter.
Hornaday begins active communication through letters and cable with Werner.
Boy has become quite unmanageable, will not obey keepers and resists control. Think it unwise for us to punish him for several reasons. Without you, he is a very unruly savage.
On September 27, 1906, Werner arrived in New York at the Bronx Zoological Society and turned Otabenga over to the custody of Reverend James H. Gordon at the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, even though Otabenga was 28. His month-long residency at the Bronx Zoo was over. On January 1910, after 4 years in New York City, Otabenga was relocated to the Lynchburg Theological Seminary in Lynchburg, Virginia. There, he was enrolled in classes.
Otabenga was one of those, they felt they could educate him. The fact that he was in the zoo carried a negative message about him. So they wanted to, in some way, establish the fact that he was educable. And hence they brought him to the seminary and introduced him to Professor Hayes, who was very interested in educating everybody. Ota tried to go to school for a while, but he just did not feel fit in. He didn't fit in too well.
I was so young, I just have visions of him. But my brother Hunter Hayes, he knew him very well because Ota was the father of a young boy. And then over here, he didn't see his children anymore. So Hunter became his son. And Hunter was very fortunate because Professor Hayes had died. And so Ota was a substitute father for him. And my brother, when he would tell me the stories, and he told me many stories, I could see that Ota was really a father and really dear to him because sometimes there would be tears in his eyes. My brother just died a couple of years ago. He was the youngest of the Hayes boys. And he said, and what he would do when he would take us into the woods, he would say, Ota would bring us here, and he taught me how to fish, he taught me how to make the fishing rods, he taught me how to hunt. He did everything just like he would have done his young son.
Ota Benga dropped out of school and worked at the tobacco factory and continued wishing and hoping to return to his homeland. Ota Benga, unable to return to Africa, was reported to have secured a rifle with which he took his own life in Lynchburg, Virginia on March 20th, 1916, at the age of 32. It is reported that close enough to midnight, he built a fire in front of which he sat and meditated before putting a bullet right through his chest. He was buried in an unmarked grave, with his death certificate listing his name as Ota Benga. In life, the recognition of his humanity eluded him, and in death, a recognized location where he can be respected and honored has also eluded him, dislocated in life and in death. It is rumored that his resting place is unmarked to throw off grave robbers and evolutionists searching for his skeletal remains in the name of scientific research.
We don't really know whether or not Ota Benga committed suicide or not, but we can certainly understand how he might consider it. I mean, he was an individual who was taken from his land, separated from his family, separated from everything that he knew, and brought to America to be on display for the whole world to see, humiliated like an animal, people being entertained by his captivity, that he could have lost all hope and took his own life and thought that the only way that he could get back home and be reunited with his family was to kill himself. And in the African context, that's really often thought of as an act against nature. And it might just illustrate to us the level of despair that Ota Benga experienced.
I'd like to see the memory of Ota Benga live on because it shows how perfectly normal and respected people behave even when they don't consider themselves racist. They end up acting like racists anyway when they are dealing with people who are significantly different. You know the trouble that people have if they're of a different color in America or anywhere else. And you know even more trouble if you're short. And he had both of those impediments in our society. But in his own society, he was well-respected, perfectly normal person with perfectly normal ways of getting along with his environment. And in fact, in some ways, I mean, he had 300 different words to describe ants.
The legacy of the Ota Benga syndrome and human zoo mentality continues with the 21st century. Ironically, just as the World's Fair and Olympics introduced the menace, we witness it today in sporting arenas. Olympic gold medalist Tommy Smith recalls his own experience as an athlete, put on the fields to entertain, but deprived of basic human rights, and punished for protesting those infringements.
64 years after Ota Benga's 1904 display, where he was completely stripped of all dignity, it is mind-boggling to believe that we were experiencing the same feelings in 1968.
The age of Otabenga is not over. I mean, we are still in the shadows of Otabenga's period, when the attitudes of a large part of the American society are still attitudes that would, if the opportunity presented itself, give credence to the same type of treatment of other human beings as Otabenga was treated. You see, my conclusion about all of this is that human nature, if it changes at all, is incremental, changes incrementally. And in the case of what we call the inferiorization of African people, the change has been extremely gradual. And so I think that when you look at what happens to many African American young people in the American society, I mean, particularly when we talk about the wanton violence against African men, particularly, but also women in this country, it's the same element. It's no different. I mean, it's just a different time, but it's the same element. I mean, the police shootings, for example, where a policeman would shoot a black person multiple times. It is very rare that you hear of a story like this among white people, where a policeman shot a white man 40 times, or mistook a white man who was asking for help and then shot him 12 times. I mean, this is not done. And why is it not done? It is not done because of the Otabenga syndrome. And that syndrome is that the life of black people is not as valuable as the life of white people. So we're not out of it, but I'll tell you one thing. I believe that with the same courage and the same determination as Otabenga to demonstrate his humanity, we also find increasingly among African people the same sense of courage. And ultimately we must be out of it.
Now, who will be responsible for fulfilling his wish and returning his remains to his land and people to rest in dignity? There is nothing we can do now about his experience at the St. Louis World's Fair and the Bronx Zoo. That was in the past, for which we were not present. We can simply shrug and say he was a victim of the circumstance in history, the sort of pervasive ignorance in the early 20th century. Or we can make it a priority that his remains be identified and returned in our time. That was literally his dying wish, and we certainly are empowered to grant it. He had little dignity in life, but we can bestow and restore some to him in death.